Yes, well, with me now and joining me throughout the show is my fantastic panel. Look at them. There they are. Jason Reed, UK lead at Young Voices, women's rights campaigner Kellie-Jay and political commentator, the one, the only, André Walker. So, look, we're going to get stuck in to my monologue first. And, Jason, I'll start with you, my good man. What are your views on that? My opinion is that we are well and truly in a post-truth era.
I don't think that's a fair assessment of where we are, to be honest. My concern with part of what you said, when you said that the suggestion that the person has a penis means that they must be a man, that seems like a huge step backwards to me. I thought we'd come further than that in accepting trans people's identities and accepting that it's perfectly possible to have a different gender identity.
Biologically?
Of course, well, biologically people can have operations, but just because somebody has a penis, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a man. Just because someone has a cervix, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a woman. If you're trans, you're statistically much more likely to be diagnosed with depression, to attempt suicide, and indeed to commit suicide. And I think a lot of that is a direct result of the kind of rhetoric that you produce just there. It's the stigmatization, it's the alienation of an entire group of people, and it needs to stop.
That's it.
All right, Jason, I'm going to come back to you. I would like to start by saying as well, all right, OK, both the panellists there did disagree with what you said about the trans issue. I did as well. But it's important that you can come on television and certainly come on any show that I'm doing and feel comfortable to make that point. And I always stand for that kind of thing. And I hope that you don't feel as though, you know, just because I'm against you that I think you're... Well, I do think you're wrong, but it's not really the point. You know what I mean. Anyway, but let's just focus on another element of what I said there, if that's OK, Jason, which is what's going on in the channel at the moment. Now, this people, not migrants thing, I've made my point pretty clear there. I think you can be both. I'm concerned now at the lines that are being pumped out by, especially the likes of Amnesty, which is they're all asylum seekers. Well, one thing to emerge from the incredibly tragic situation that happened, of course, earlier this week was that it emerged that some of those people were not asylum seekers. How do you feel about what's happening in the channel at the moment and some of the rhetoric around it?
I think pointing out that they're people, not migrants, is important. Of course, we know that people can be more than one thing. But the way we talk about channel crossings sometimes suggests a degree of dehumanisation when we talk about wave machines and we're talking about ways to turn the boats back, that they're just an inconvenience, that we just need to push them back over there so that they're not our concern. I think there is certainly a lot of responsibility that needs to fall on the French government's shoulders, that they're not doing enough to stop these dangerous crossings. They're not doing enough to intercept these horrible, exploitative people trafficking gangs. But at the same time, Britain is a global superpower. We have to do our part as well. We should be taking in more people than we are taking in, and we should in general have a more compassionate attitude to people. I can't imagine being so desperate that I'm willing to climb into one of those unsafe dinghies, possibly with children in tow, to make that perilous channel crossing. And I think if people are willing, people are at that point, we should show a bit more compassion.
But Patrick, do you suppose, though, Jason, there is another side to it, which is, yes, I think we can all agree we want to smash the human trafficking rings. I think another way of doing it as well is finding a way of stopping these boats ultimately being delivered to Calais. No boats, no crossings at the end of the day. But maybe, Jason, we do need to have a look at changing our asylum system, because at the moment, pretty much as I understand it, you have to basically get here to claim asylum. And some might say that's encouraging people making this trip.
Well, we do need to do something radical to stop this situation. I don't even think stopping boats getting to Calais would solve the problem, because then you just have people climbing into the back of lorries, and we've seen in the past how tragic that can be as well. This is, as I said before, I think it's the French government that needs to pull its finger out and do a lot more. There was one case a few weeks ago, they broke the record for the number of crossings in one day, with over 1,000 crossings, and their excuse for not stopping any of the boats was that it was a bank holiday, and also that Kamala Harris was visiting, and so some of their resources were off dealing with that. That's just completely unacceptable.
Blaming Kamala Harris for illegal immigration? Surely not. Carry on.
The situation as it stands now, with all these crossings in the channel, nobody supports that. Whether you're the most pro or the most anti-immigration person in the world, nobody thinks that what's happening now is a good thing. And so the only explanation for what's happening now is widespread government incompetence, just inability to deal with this one way or another, whether it's processing the asylum seekers and the others in France, whether it's doing something else to stop the people trafficking gangs. Something has to be done, because we can't carry on like this.
Hang on, sir. Now, I'm going to bring in my fantastic panel who've been reunited. Now, who do I go to first? I'll go to Jason first. Jason Reed, of course, UK lead at Young Voices. Let's just ground it again in what we started this discussion as. Is the phrase Megxit, is the word Megxit sexist?
Look, misogyny is a real and very important issue. There are countless examples of it in the world. This is not one of them. This is just a continuation of one of the most privileged people, living one of the most privileged lives imaginable, continually using her enormous platform to moan about how she's the victim of some grand conspiracy and how everyone's out to get her and how she's going to have to use her new Netflix deal and her new Spotify deal to tell us all again how difficult her life is. Megxit is not an abusive term, it's not insulting, it is, as Charles Ray was saying, it's just a play on Brexit. It's descriptive, if nothing else. I'd say it's neutral. It certainly isn't misogynistic, and this is just another PR-driven, attention-seeking ploy from Meghan and Harry because they want us to keep talking about them so that they don't become irrelevant.
Gosh, can you imagine a world where they're just totally irrelevant? Anyway.
Remember, she offered to live in Windsor Castle. So basically, she thought what was going to happen was they're going to boot out the Queen and she's going to move in instead. And when
Can you see maybe potentially how the royal family did make Meghan and Harry's lives pretty tricky?
For the record, I'm also happy to offer to live in Windsor Castle. If that's something that's going. There was certainly some unkind coverage, perhaps, if we're going to be really kind to Meghan. But, I mean, that's sort of what you sign up for. It's hard to have much sympathy when you're marrying into the royal family. It's hard to think of a bigger step up.
But do you think the royals maybe made them so? You know, do you think the royals could have done more? Wills, Kate, the Queen, do you think they maybe made their lives a bit difficult? Maybe they were briefing against them a bit.
Well, there was obviously a culture clash. Meghan has talked recently about how she feels that the other members of the royal family just didn't understand her relationship with her father, for example. They didn't understand why she wasn't able to just talk to him and to make him stop doing the unhelpful media briefings that he was doing. There was obviously a big difference in life experience, a very big culture clash going on when she tried to join that family. But the way she's responded to that is just the most undignified response she possibly could have come up with. And so I think it's very, very difficult to have sympathy with.
Should a campaign like this avoid using the word Christmas? Jason, I'll throw it over to you. I've started with you every time, so I see no reason why we shouldn't continue in this case. Can you see where they're coming from? Do you think that maybe it should just say things like festivities or, I don't know, Yuletide? That might be worse. I'm not sure what the rules are.
It sounds like this came from a place of good intentions, but it's clearly misguided. No one's offended by the word Christmas. Even if you don't celebrate it, it doesn't make any difference if you see a TV advert with a slogan that mentions Christmas in it. This is just an example of people who work in Whitehall not really understanding what ordinary people in the rest of the country care about and what offends them and what doesn't offend them. And so spending a lot of time worrying about things like this that no one's going to really take any notice of whether it says Christmas or not.
Look, it's a relatively big question, this. Do you think there is an issue in this country when it comes to whether or not we are still a Christian country? Do you care, for example? Do you think we are? Is things like this and potentially looking to ban the word Christmas a symbol of maybe where we're heading?
That's a big question. You don't make it easy for me, do you? I think it's good that we're becoming more aware of these kinds of issues, that we're a multicultural country, we're no longer homogenous, we don't all think the same way, we don't all live the same lives, and that's a good thing. At the same time, this is not the way to express that. We've had this conversation many times before with the difference between Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. We all know that some people don't celebrate Christmas, and that's fine. It's not an issue anymore. It's not something that our civil servants should be spending time worrying about. It's just a non-issue.
No. Jason, look, do you think... I mean, look, we've touched on this before a bit about a misogynistic agenda against Meghan. What's your views on whether or not there's been a racist agenda against her?
I don't know whether there was a racist agenda. Agenda implies that there was some coordinated conspiracy, which there wasn't. There was just a lot of anger, which I think was justified. But when it comes to the intense scrutiny and politicisation of what's going on in classrooms, I'm quite uncomfortable about that. It sounds to me like this lesson, that was a perfectly reasonable question to ask in a classroom. I don't want to go down the road that you've seen in some states in the US, where when they talk about the KKK, they're not allowed to say that the KKK did anything wrong, because that would be casting judgment on a sensitive issue, and you can't do that. So I think we have to have a little bit of trust in our teachers that they can make judgments as to what's OK and what's not in the classroom.
Is there a wider... I can see that. Jason, I'll throw it to you then, which is that, you know, look, do you think Sadiq Khan cares as much about the death of often young, and actually, let's be honest, often young ethnic minorities on the streets as a result of violent crime, knife crime, etc., as he should do. You know, he seems very focused on whether or not we should be allowing President Trump into the country or whether or not we should be wearing masks on public transport. Should he care more about stabbings?
Bless him, poor Sadiq Khan. He's far too busy designing the fireworks display for New Year's Eve, with the EU flag and everything on there, so he's got no time to deal with these stabbings. I think I have a bit of a different take to André. I don't think it's an ideological issue. I think it's a competence issue. I think the Metropolitan Police in particular needs reform from top to bottom. The list of things that Cressida Dick, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, should have resigned for is very, very long indeed. At the top of the list being the handling of Sarah Everard's case and the aftermath of that. And this kind of issue, it won't be solved until we have some competent people in charge who, frankly, know what they're doing.
And Jason, what's your take on this? Have you got any questions?
Well, Frank, we hear a lot of these kinds of stories, don't we, of students overreacting to something innocuous someone said or cancelling an event with a controversial guest. But don't you think that some of this is just students adapting to the world there? I mean, a lot of these are very, very young people. We're talking about 18, 19-year-old people here, and they're entering adult life for the first time. They're reacting, possibly overcorrecting for issues that they see in the wider world, and then as they get older and they gain a bit more life experience, some of those more radical elements might just drain away by themselves, meaning it's not really a problem for wider society.
Well, I think the problem is never the students. I think the students are the product of an education system, a school system.
Well, she spoke of political and cultural debates being a thing of the past for many families at the dinner table. She acknowledged that woke young people's care for things like more important things, arguably anyway, and highlighted the importance of respecting one another's feelings. Well, panellists, is she right? I think it's a really, really unique situation that we're in at the moment, isn't it? Where there are big things that can be levelled at people. Like, if you have a view on what's going on in the channel, you're a far-right racist. If you have a view at what's going on regarding the trans lobby, you're transphobic. And actually, instead of just lobbing those things out there to silence debate, to stifle debate, Jason, shouldn't we be able to have these conversations?
That sounds to me a little bit like snowflakery, I'm afraid.
Oh.
I think parents are just upset that they're being called out by their kids on some of their outdated views, and they're upset about the fact that their kids have different priorities than they did. Perhaps the kids don't want to take up the family business, or they want to do things different to what their parents did. And their parents, you know, when you get to a certain age, perhaps you can start to feel a little bit entitled. Back in my day, we had it so much harder than you, and that kind of thing. And the kids are quite rightly pushing back against that.
Do you think that's a really interesting one? Because I suspect one of the points that she was getting at there is if a parent said, you know, expressed a view, you know, on something like integration or something like that, for example, just spitballing here, you know, would the child be inclined, do you think, more now to stifle debate? Or do you think that they are actually, what's actually happening is parents are being presented with arguments they've not heard before?
I think it's parents being presented with arguments they've not heard before. And Generation Z in particular have a very interesting way of approaching these kinds of issues. There's been a lot written about TikTok culture and the culture around satirising a lot of these hot-button social issues and debates. And other generations struggle sometimes with that because they're not familiar with that way of discussing things, that way of thinking about it. But that doesn't mean that people don't know how to argue. It's just that they see the world in a different way, and that's what you'd expect between generations.
Your take on this? I'm concerned, though, that we are heading towards a situation where one viewpoint is the only thing that's allowed to be discussed. I mentioned a little bit earlier when it came, for example, to some of the quote-unquote science around COVID, the reasons behind why we have some of these restrictions. It's almost becoming illegal to actually question whether or not those scientists are always correct. I'm concerned about a similar thing happening when it comes to the big green agenda in the environment. Are you going to be able to actually question the science behind it? Now, you can argue with the rights and wrongs of it. You can argue with whether or not, in anyone's opinion, there is an obviously correct way of looking at one of those, both of those things. That's fine. But if we're headed towards a situation, Jason, where potentially we're not really allowed to discuss those things, I'm concerned by that.
I'm afraid I don't buy into this narrative. You can question anything you like. If you say something that's obviously wrong and everyone disagrees with, you'll get called out for it. But that's exactly how it's supposed to work. That if you were to question on your show the science of coronavirus, for example, I think it's very unlikely that the police would turn up at your door and say, we've got to take you off air now. It's just you probably get called out on Twitter, quite rightly, and that's the way debate is supposed to function. I go back to the same point as before. I think a lot of people are guilty of snowflakery on this. They just don't like the fact they're being criticised. They want the right to a platform without anyone else having the right to free speech as well.
That's OK, but it still remains unclear how much damage the winds, which were close to 100 miles an hour, have caused to the technical equipment. All of this, of course, follows Richard Madeley's departure from the castle last week, doesn't it? Storm damage and evacuated celebs, etc., etc., etc. Is there any point actually continuing with the show this year? Is anyone here going to put their hand up and say they're a regular watcher of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here? Not a sausage.
Yeah,
go on, here we go.
I'd miss it if it was gone.
You'd miss it if it was gone. Talk me, go on. Should it be cancelled this year, though?
Well, this year it's been incredibly shambolic. You mentioned just a couple of things. There are even more stories than that. There was an intruder on set who had to be removed. I think a couple more celebrities have had to leave after Richard Madeley, although we don't know that because it hasn't been on air for 2 nights now. So it's been pretty shambolic. It would be understandable if it was cancelled this year, but it's one of those things that it comes at the same time every year. I remember when I'm a Celebrity is on, more than I remember what month it is. It sort of punctuates the year a little bit. Is it I'm a Celeb time? Is it Strictly time?
Yes.
You know, it's just one of those staples in times of chaos, in times of pandemics. You can rely on it. It's always going to be there. It's always exactly the same. I find it quite comforting.
Looking at it, I suppose we're going to veer away from that and towards the President of the Czech Republic. That's right, don't say we don't give you range on this show. So the President of the Czech Republic has appointed his new Prime Minister from a glass box. Yes, really. There he is. Look at him. Hang on a second. I mean, he looks well.
It's like Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah, it is, actually. It is, yeah. So Anthony Hopkins, the President of the Czech Republic, contracted COVID after a 6-week stay in hospital for an unrelated illness. So Czech rules require a COVID-positive patient to self-isolate for 2 weeks. So he appointed his new Prime Minister from a stateroom inside his official residence. I think surely they should just have waited. Jason, you know, look, I suppose there's an argument, isn't there, of our leaders have to send a message. Any leader has to send a message. The Queen's done it quite well at times, let's be honest, you know, about stoicism and this, that and the other. What message does that send, do you think?
Well, I feel sorry for the population of the Czech Republic. If you're a Czech person and you're patriotic and this ceremony is supposed to be a big thing in national politics and this is the ridiculous theatre that you've got showing the rest of the world, this is how we do politics in our country. But at the same time, if it was the Queen in that situation, I think we would probably want absolutely everything to be done possible to protect her, even if that means the ridiculous situation where you have people, you know, in almost riot gear to cart her in, make sure no one else breathes near her.
It's maybe only a matter of time. We can see it there, boss in a box. There he is. Look at that.
The fact that he's wielded an out as well into the glass box. I would have maybe liked to have seen a moulded Perspex thing just around the chair.
There's a touch of
I think that would have been better.
the Lenins about him, isn't there?
I saw then, I've only just spotted it on the screen in front of me, the hazmat suit bloke who brought him in. I mean, come on. You know what they should have done? They should have had like a waxwork of him, just with a mouth opened and
Or done it by Zoom.
Yeah, that's right.
Or a hologram.
Or a hologram. Yes, there he is. It's happening again. The hazmat man's back. It could be hazmat woman. There's no way of telling. Hazmat thing. So, should schools finish early for Christmas? Where to start with this one? Jason Reed, what do you think?
I think that ideally we'd keep all the schools open. If this was what's required to save Christmas, then I'm all for it, because it seems like it's not the most damaging of the COVID restrictions. You were talking earlier, André, about the mental health effects of lockdown. Closing schools for a couple of weeks in the lead up to Christmas would probably be seen as an extension of the holiday rather than missing out on a huge amount of education. I don't know about you, but in the last couple of weeks at the end of the year, I didn't learn very much anyway.
No, that's true.
The teacher would usually put a film on. I worried that we're...
What, for a month?
Just one Lord of the Rings film.
I worry that we're replicating what happened last year, where, of course, the scientists were saying to Boris Johnson, we need to have a quick circuit breaker lockdown in order to save Christmas, and he delayed it and delayed it, and the result was that there was still Tier 4 restrictions over Christmas. And so if we're able to do something small like this now to protect Christmas, that would seem to me to be a good thing.
Well, Kelly,
the haves and the have-nots have pulled apart, and I think this education thing makes it worse.
OK, all right. So we're just going to stay on this for one more. Jason, is there an argument in your mind to say that maybe it's the best thing to do to allow COVID almost to rip through schools and to rip through that? Because actually then our children can build up some elements of natural immunity.
Well, it's hard to say with this new variant going around. We don't know much about it. We don't know how deadly it's going to be. We don't know the transmissibility, whether it has a degree of vaccine resistance. And so I think, as far as possible, it makes sense to stay on the safe side a little bit. I think, as I say, closing schools for a couple of weeks before Christmas is not the end of the world. Those issues that you both have been talking about are very real in terms of if we were going to do this for any longer. Yeah. But I'm just very worried about Christmas. I can see it coming already.
I can tell you are very worried. OK, so I'm a northerner.
Yes.
You're a northerner. Where are you from, if you don't mind?
I'm from the West Country.
From the West Country, yourself?
I'm Italian, so...
You're just straight up Italian. Well, anyway, apparently, in case you were thinking, gosh, that Patrick guy, he looks like a proper northerner. Gosh, that André Walker, he's definitely a proper northerner. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what a proper northerner looks like. Hey, there he is. It's Burnley manager Sean Dyche casually strolling out in what looked like a blizzard at Turf Moor yesterday. This was for Burnley's clash against Tottenham. It was postponed, actually, in the end due to the heavy snow covering. But it was unfortunate, the fact that this game was postponed. It was Burnley Spurs for this couple, right, who travelled almost 31 hours from Dallas, Texas, to watch the match. They say they were fuelled by coffee, cheese crackers, and more coffee, but I think it's fantastic, that, isn't it? How far have you travelled for an event for it to not go ahead? Certainly not as far as Dallas to Burnley, although I did make the point earlier, if they're Spurs fans, they should be used to a lifetime of crushing disappointment by now, shouldn't they? I mean, what do you make of that? Is that madness, or do you think that's a sign of a good, hard northern man?
I think good for him. There was a moment in the clip there where you could see in his face he knew he'd made a mistake. But he couldn't back out at that point.
Yeah.
Looking at him. I respect him for sticking with it. I respect the bold decision of not putting a jacket on in the first place. The part of the story I'm most interested in, I want to know how many Spurs fans there are in Texas who regularly... Do they fly over regularly for the matches?
Well,
how does that happen?
Spurs is a massive club.
No, do you know...
Very quickly, what do you think about this story? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think as a nation we need to drink less?
No. I think the only proper reaction to a story like this is to say, seriously, really, is this what Cambridge University are coming out with now? We've just come out of a pandemic. Just leave us alone. There's nothing wrong with having a drink. Why are we accepting it as a given that we need to drink less and we're just debating what the best way to get there is? Maybe we should be drinking more. I think that's a rational reaction to what's been happening in the world.
Well, I mean, you know...
Hey, men's that, brother. I assumed you'd be a bit of a lefty before I met you.
That's a resounding endorsement, of course. Now,